Well, thank you so much. It's really my pleasure to be here with you all today. So my name is Brittany Travers, and I'm an associate professor in the occupational therapy program and Department of Kinesiology here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And my research lab is also at the Waisman Center. So I'm really excited to get to be here with you all today. So Autism Day with the Experts is actually one of my favorite days. I've been able to be in attendance ever since I moved here to Wisconsin. I think it was now 10 years ago. So before I launch into the research, I do want to provide a disclaimer about the language that I'm going to be using today. So based on recent research into how individuals on the autism spectrum or autistic individuals preferred to be referenced, I will be trying my best to use identity first language during this presentation. And so talking about autistic and non-autistic individuals rather than individuals on the autism spectrum. I want to say that I probably will make mistakes, so your patience and grace will be very much appreciated. I also want to say that I recognize that any language that we use to collectively refer to a group of individuals may make us feel uncomfortable and may not have 100% endorsement from all parties. But to address this in all future studies, we will be directly asking participants and their families what language they prefer us to be using in our work so that we can make sure that we represent the wishes of our community. I'm also more than happy to discuss this further with you all, as you all are our community stakeholders as well. Okay, so with that, I want to start this talk by saying thank you. My deepest gratitude to the participants and their families. I want to express this work that I'm going to present to you took so many hours. It was a 3-day-a-week, an hour each time for 6 weeks study, and without all the effort and the time of the participants and getting people back and forth, the transportation, this work would not have been possible. So thank you. I also want to thank my amazing team in the Motor and Brain Development Lab and my amazing collaborators who have made this work as rigorous as possible. I also want to thank the funding agencies. Okay, so I get to talk to you today about one of my favorite topics, which is neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity is the notion that the brain is not static, but it is constantly adapting to our experiences. And there are so many nuances to neuroplasticity that I will not be able to get into today, but I highly recommend David Eagleman's book, which I show here, which is called Live Wired, for those of you who are interested in learning more. So the general idea with neuroplasticity is that we have repeated experiences. So for example, we teach ourselves to juggle and we practice until we're actually kind of juggling. And then these experiences cause the neurons in our brain to activate and fire. And the areas or the neurons that fire together are going to be making connections with each other and then wiring together. And this wiring together is going to have an impact on the brain wiring across the brain. So over time, we will rewire the brain at the level of these white matter connections. And this will allow populations of neurons to effectively communicate with each other. Now, we're really lucky that we have a promising method to really study the brain wiring, and we have this at the Waisman Center, and this is called diffusion tensor imaging. And diffusion tensor imaging is able to have to create these beautiful brain wiring pictures that I show you here. And what happens is a person steps into our magnetic resonance imaging scanner, and then in about 5 to 15 minutes, we're able to get these brain scans. And this is an example brain scan of a diffusion tensor image. And what's happening is diffusion tensor imaging is looking at how water molecules are moving throughout the brain and telling us information then about what the brain tissue looks like. So if we take a voxel in this image or a little cube in our image, what we can do is we can use our magnetic resonance imaging to look to see how a water molecule is moving around in that voxel. So for this one, I picked a voxel that doesn't have a lot of brain tissue around it. It's mostly fluid. But if I move over just a little bit in the brain image on that white matter, those are going to be those white matter tracks. And it's going to be made up of bundles of myelinated axons. And the myelination is a fatty layer that goes around these axons that allows fast and efficient transmission and activation throughout the brain. And so here, when we look at how the water molecule is moving, it gets caught up. It can't pass through the fatty layer. So it gets caught up and the movement is restricted. So from this, we are able to mathematically calculate measures of the amount of white matter wiring that there is within this, within certain brain areas. And we're also able to look at the amount of spread of those white matter tracks. So after a lot of learning in neuroplasticity, what we might expect is there to be more wiring, and there also be more spread of wiring as the axons and neurons and dendrites are trying to make connections with each other. So the last 2 decades of research have shown that motor interventions may be a particularly effective way to bring about neuroplasticity. And so the reasoning behind this is that our brains need to have not only a mental representation of our body just, standing there in space, but we also need to have separate mental representations for all the different ways that we move our body. So for when we're walking, when we're running, when our body is on a bicycle. And when you think about all the amazing activities that we can do with our body and how complicated these activities are, our brain is constantly adapting to our experiences to be able to allow us to do these really incredible activities. And something I marvel about is that we probably have mental representations for things that we've never actually experienced in our body, like flying through space. But our mental representation gives us what the senses of that might feel like, even though we've just imagined it. So the work I'm going to show you today really was inspired by a study that came out now 11 years ago, and it showed that balance training changes the brain in non-autistic adults. And this was very intensive balance training, and it showed key changes in the white matter areas of the brain, really across multiple areas of the brain. And when I saw this, I immediately thought, well, what about in autism? Would a balance intervention have similar effects? And so my work and the work of others suggests that it is really important to be studying motor interventions in autism because motor challenges are highly prevalent in autism. And of those motor challenges, balance challenges are particularly common. We also know that motor challenges are linked with autism symptom severity and also with poor daily living skills. And our work and the work of others suggests that the early developing brainstem is linked to both motor challenges and symptom severity. So these motor challenges in a motor intervention may tell us something about the brain, both in autism and in non-autistic individuals as well. So the premise of this research was, can motor interventions impact balance, impact symptom severity, impact daily living skills, and also potentially change the wiring of the brain? And in doing this, we kind of took a spoonful of sugar approach and we tried to really gamify the intensive balance training. And so with this, we had our game, which we call our video game-based balance training with visual feedback, so quite a mouthful. And a participant steps onto the Wii balance board, and the Kinect camera is able to project the image of the person onto a TV screen in front of them. And the participant will train their balance on some very well-known Tai Chi and yoga poses while standing on the Wii balance board. And so I'm going to show you a quick video of me. This is me trying out our Karate Kid pose. So I'm stepping into the shadow, and this is me looking at the screen here. And when I'm in the shadow, all my dots turn yellow. And I know that I'm doing well because the background's slowly coming into play and there's a green dot at the bottom. But when I dip out of the shadow, what happens is I see the dots where I'm no longer doing the pose correctly, and everything comes to a stop. One thing I want to communicate is that this training, while we try to make it as fun as possible, is very hard work. So participants are standing on one foot for up to 4 minutes at a time, and then doing pose after pose after pose of that for an hour. And we needed this to be a very intensive training to make sure that we were getting across our really getting across the potential of having those neuroplasticity effects. So a couple of years ago, I was able to present at this event and to share with you some of our preliminary data from this training, which found that this training was found to improve balance, and also it was perceived as both enjoyable and beneficial by the participants and their families. But we designed this training to see, can this training change symptom severity, daily living skills, and the brain? So we set out in the study I'm going to talk more about today to really try to rigorously test these neuroplasticity effects. And we did so with a study design that is really one of the most rigorous that we know of, and it's called a randomized control trial. So what happens in this is we had autistic and non-autistic adolescents be recruited for the study. And then we did a pre-assessment where we did diagnostic assessments, postural stability measures, so measures of balance, diffusion tensor imaging, and then also parent-reported measures of symptom severity and daily living skills. After the pre-assessment, we basically flipped a coin, although it actually took place in an Excel spreadsheet, where we would randomly assign each participant to either the balance training group, so 6 weeks of this balance training intervention, which I described to you just prior, or they were randomly assigned to a 6-week sedentary control condition. Now, this control condition was designed to match the balance condition as tightly as possible. So it was the same research assistants who worked with the participants in the same lab space for the same number of days for the same amount of time, except that the key difference was that the participant was learning video games that they were learning by sitting down, whereas in the balance training, they were really working on their balance. So after the 6 weeks, we did post-assessments, so post-training assessments that repeated the postural stability measures, the diffusion tensor imaging scan, and also the parent-reported symptom severity and daily living skill assessments. So this led to having 4 different groups within this study. So we had a group of autistic participants who were randomly assigned to the balance training, a group of non-autistic participants assigned to the balance training, a group of autistic participants assigned to the sedentary control group, and a group of non-autistic participants assigned to the sedentary control group. So all participants were adolescents, so 13 to 17.9 years of age, and they communicated verbally and had approximately average IQ. In this study, we hypothesized that the video game-based balance training would lead to balance improvements, symptom severity improvements, daily living skill improvements, and also changes in the brain wiring. And then we also use this as an opportunity to examine if these changes in the brain wiring were similar or different in autistic individuals compared to non-autistic individuals. Okay, so what did we find? So first and foremost, we found that the balance training led to improved balance, and this was consistent with what we found in our prior study. So specifically during the game, we found that there were longer balance times over the course of the study. And on average, the participants increased their one-footed balance times by 36 seconds. And that was from the very beginning of the 6 weeks to the end of the 6 weeks. Now, 36 seconds may not actually seem like a whole lot of time, but if you think about tasks like walking on a slippery surface like ice, where you might need to balance on that 1 foot and might need a little additional time, 36 seconds on 1 foot is actually quite a bit of time. I also was very excited to see that we had almost identical balance gains between the autistic and non-autistic participants. And so even though the group with autism started out with some of the shorter balance times, the rate at which they gained balance was identical compared to the non-autistic group. We also showed in our pre and post measures that the balance training group showed improved balance outside of the game, and this was above and beyond any improvement that we saw in the sedentary control group, which suggests that the balance gains are not just maturation or just naturally coming along because you've done it twice, but it really did seem to be driven by the balance training. Interestingly enough, too, we also found that this outside of the game balance effect was driven by the autistic participants, which suggests that they generalized the balance gains from within the game to outside of the game, potentially even better than the non-autistic participants. We also found that balance training led to decreased autism symptom severity. So in this graph at the bottom, we have our pre-training measure of symptom severity and our post-training measure of symptom severity. And higher scores here indicated more severe autism symptoms. And you can see here within our autistic participants that the purple and the X is the autistic participants in the balance training group who started out at a severe level of autism symptoms that then decreased to moderate after the training. Whereas those with autism in our sedentary control condition did not change in their autism symptom severity over the course of the study. Contrary to our hypotheses, we found that balance training did not change daily living skills. And this might be because daily living skills are oftentimes kind of complicated, and any balance improvements may not naturally lead to improvements in tasks like being able to cook for oneself or clean up or just do some of those everyday tasks. So now for the big question on neuroplasticity. So were there brain wiring changes from this balance study, and which areas of the brain, if any, changed as a function of the balance training compared to the control condition? So I do want to remind you, just before I show these results, that this is a very rigorous test because each person served as their own control. So all these brain changes that I'm going to be showing you were based off of each individual starting point before the study. And what we found was that the balance training group showed changes in the superior cerebellar peduncle, which is shown here, the sagittal stratum, and the cingulate gyrus. And so all of these areas are associated with sensory motor control and have been linked to both balance training and autism symptom severity in previous research. In these areas, what we found was increased brain wiring volume, so more brain wiring, and also an increased spread in the balance training group. Our next step was to examine whether these balance training brain changes were consistent across the non-autistic and autistic groups. And indeed, we found a number of areas of distinct neuroplasticity responses to balance training, really across the brain. So this is not only in the cerebellum, but we have parietal lobe, we have temporal lobe, we have frontal lobe. So really there was not an area of the brain that didn't show some type of distinct neuroplasticity response. And this is really important because it shows that although the behavioral improvements and balance were nearly identical between the autistic and non-autistic participants, the brain areas responsible for these behavioral challenges, or for these behavioral changes, were often distinct. So we also examined what brain changes were associated with changes in autism symptom severity, and then the individual differences in balance training gains. So while multiple areas were involved, there was one brain area of overlap that we kept finding over and over in the different results. And that was in the superior cerebellar peduncle. So this white matter pathway transmits information from the cerebellum to the brainstem and the rest of the brain. It is one of the brain areas that is most highly associated with balance, really across multiple populations. It has been linked to proprioception, so feeling your body in space. It's been linked to motor challenges and expressive language challenges in both autistic and non-autistic populations. And while we cannot at this point from the study design conclusively determine that this region is central to the behavioral changes we saw, we can say that the evidence here leads us to think that this brain region is an important one to follow up on in future research. So a quick summary of our findings. We found that 6 weeks of the video game-based balance training was found to improve balance and to also decrease autism symptom severity, although we did not find the anticipated changes in the daily living skills. We also found a wide range of balance-related structural changes across the brain, and these changes were oftentimes distinct in the autistic participants compared to the non-autistic participants. So what does this all mean? So some of the key takeaways from our study is that our study suggests that balance training may be an effective method for improving balance and decreasing parent-reported autism symptom severity. However, in future studies, we are hoping to include even larger sample sizes that will more fully reflect just individual differences across the autism spectrum. We also are planning in future research to include pre and post measures of quality of life, as we think that these measures are going to be more meaningful than just parent-reported symptom severity measures. And also in future research, we are hoping to do follow-ups to see how long-lasting the effects of this training are. So does it last 2 weeks, 6 weeks, a year, 2 years? We just do not know at this time. This work also showed that the brain may be wired differently in autism, such that similar behaviors like improvements in balance times may rely on distinct brain mechanisms. So in many ways, this actually may be unsurprising if we think about how brain wiring changes in response to our sensory and motor experiences and how plastic the brain is. And the fact that autistic individuals may have unique sensory and motor experiences really across the lifespan. In future work, we are really hoping to dig a little bit deeper into the superior cerebellar peduncle to really better understand its potential role in balance training and symptom severity changes in autistic and non-autistic individuals. So thank you so much for your time and attention. I am happy and eager to answer any questions and would love to hear your reactions to this work. And just a quick reminder that you can put your questions and reactions in the comment section.